You have somehow ended up listening to The Stuff That's Real That You Didn't Know Was Real, but also is cool podcast. Or Sturty Dickwur Bayik. Or, never mind.
All right, well, welcome back to the show. I hope you've had a great week. I hope you've listened numerous times to the previous week's episodes just to extract every useful tidbit of information out of them. We've got more information for you today. We've got exciting stuff to talk about, stuff I'm really excited about, actually, and just hearing what Kevin's going to talk about, it's going to be a good episode. It's going to be a good episode. So thanks for being with us. I'm going to just turn it over to Mr. Tumlinson here, and we will get this show on the road.
Oh man, pressure.
No pressure.
No pressure. What we just want to jump right into things. There's no preamble. We're not gonna.
But we can preamble. Let's preamble. Let's amble. Let's just amble.
Let's just amble.
Let's just amble a little bit.
I think we're short on time, is what you were saying earlier. So we may not be able to amble much. But
through no fault of my own. No, I'm just kidding. It's completely my fault. But no, we'll just amble quick. You doing good? You had a good week thinking nonstop about what you're going to talk about this week?
Yeah, that's what I spent the whole week doing. I didn't have anything else to do because at the time that this is recording, we just came out of this big cold snap here in Texas where everybody was out of power for like a week and got down to the 30s and inside the house.
Yeah, my family has been cooped up at my parents' house. They're upper middle class, so they have had power the whole week. My brother, who's middle class, has not had power at all. He lives a mile away.
I think this is coincidental.
Go figure. Coincident, nothing to do with that income levels at all. Totally.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So so while staying warm, I thought, what could I talk about on this week's show if I survive long enough to talk about it? The article I came up with, I think, is going to be a fun one, and it's something on my mind because you and I both write what has been themed archaeological thrillers. A subset of archaeology is anthropology, which is the study of cultures and humanity. Something that I've been interested in for a very long time. And this article, coming off of what's the site? Science Alert. It's titled 9 Species of Human Once Walked the Earth. Now there's just one. Did we kill the rest? Dun, dun, dun.
I'm going to go ahead and say that we did. Am I right?
I don't know. The article doesn't really, it actually does not. I mean, it sort of implies that we did, but it was sort of like a battle of attrition, because as the more adaptable species proliferated, we'll say, we started to use up more and more resources. So ultimately, we did sort of kill off these other species through a combination of things like, resource usage, actual physical combat did occur. We know that happened. Wars between species and that sort of thing. But there was some interspecies mating and things along those lines that also slowly sort of weeded out these other species. So as the millennia wound by, a combination of things led to Homo sapiens becoming the dominant human species. So, but you've heard of some of these, like Neanderthals or Homo neanderthalensis. I'll pronounce that correctly at some point. Then there's a whole bunch of related, similar species, Homo erectus.
It's like where Cro-Magnon comes in.
Yeah, exactly.
Something like that. Yeah.
But the one I was interested in is Homo. I'm gonna see if I can pronounce this. Homo floresiensis, which is they've been known as the hobbits. They've been
okay. Oh,
hobbits. Yeah. That's interesting because that's an Indonesian segment of human population that was in known as the red deer cave people in China. That is really interesting to me, and they were dubbed hobbits by the anthropologists studying them because they were all nerds and they'd all read Lord of the Rings, and this is a small species of humans pretty interesting stuff. And you kind of got to wonder like what happened, because you would think in Indonesia they're more or less isolated from the rest of the cultures.
Yeah.
So I don't know. That was just an interesting study all around. Knowing that there were 9 different species that we know of, we're still looking for that mysterious missing link, which was the leap between ancient humanity and modern humanity. So
that was that the leap where the size of the brain in Homo sapiens suddenly got much larger? Is that what that same leap is? Or because I've heard that too, like
that's what they're looking
70,000 years ago or so, we think that Homo sapiens split off because we're not the strongest mammal, we're not the strongest, we're not as strong as gorillas or even chimps, and we're not as strong as what we believe some of these other species to have been, but we're still here. We're not the only ones to use tools. We're not the only. So it was almost like there's something, all else being equal. And I think that's kind of like another way to say evolution. All else being equal, the strongest survive. And so if this particular species that is with us today, Homo sapien, is the strongest one, what is it about us? Is it the brain? I think that's kind of the trajectory that we're on, right?
A theory that involves our consumption of proteins. Because the cost of our intellect was things like we had to be born earlier because if our heads were fully formed, we basically wouldn't be able to be born. Our skulls would prevent us from being born, so we had to be born a lot earlier than most mammals are in the developmental process. Like we're born unable to walk or even care for ourselves. So
like whereas a deer just pops out and it's like running around eating stuff immediately, right?
Exactly, active and moving that day. And there's this whole idea that meat eating and eating heavy proteins was in part responsible for us developing the intellect we have, because there's a sort of genetic and biological cost to the development of higher intellect. So our ability to hunt became tantamount to our intelligence. So we weren't as fast, we weren't as strong, we were not the top of the food chain for a while there, but those of us that were smart enough to figure out other means of getting that meat suddenly became dominant. So we started using things like traps and weapons and whatever we needed to bring down that mastodon or bring down that big cat, and then we could consume that protein, and then that protein became the fuel for intelligence. So that's one of the theories. The reason we became dominant is because we migrated from being a gatherer society to a hunter society, or hunter-gatherer, I guess, but we were primarily existing and subsisting on meat, which, so there you go. Eat more meat if you want to be smarter.
If you want to evolve into a higher hominid.
Yeah. And now we've got the geniuses of our society, like Bill Gates, telling everybody that if we're a wealthy nation, we need to be eating fake meat, so plant-based meat. So what do you think I can think of a consequence of that will probably end up in a book. So
there you go. That's interesting, because I think that's a completely different issue trying to be tackled by some of these guys like Bill Gates. And that's just the way the meat industry is run, at least in America, is just not as sustainable as some other options.
Right.
I think his whole thing isn't from a dietary perspective. He's saying, hey, you know what? You can get some of the same stuff out of fake meat, whatever. I think it's really cool, the stuff, the strides that we're making in that field. But I also think it's really cool to eat giant gobs of meat.
Yeah.
From an actual animal.
Wouldn't it be interesting though to explore that idea? That's one of the reasons why I brought it up. Is our most intelligent product of our genes. They're all now saying, let's start moving away from the consumption of meat and more towards plant-based. But if we can trace the origins of our intelligence to meat proteins, then what are the long-term unforeseen consequences of shifting? And what if that's happened before? So if there were 9 species of human, and we believe that there are these sort of hidden histories and cultures that we no longer have access because they are so far buried in the past, we don't know what happened to them. What if one of the things that happened to them was they got so smart that they started doing the things that were detrimental to that intelligence, and so they eventually sort of reset, and then there's a cycle of that happening over and over. We've always wondered what happened if there was a superiorly intelligent, if there was a superior intelligence on our planet in the past, where did it go? Where did that advanced civilization go? We've always assumed it was a cataclysm, or their technology advanced to the point where it decimated them. But what if it was dietary?
Or both? What if it was a lot of things?
Right.
Diets changed at the same time, because we know we've had cataclysmic things happen on Earth in geologic scale relatively recently. And so why not throw a couple things? I mean, if we learn anything about, astronomical time and just how big and slow the universe is in human terms, there's no reason to believe that there's no reason not to believe that a perfect storm of bad things happening all at once has happened multiple times. And so I'm kind of the belief that hey, why not all of these things? Why not diets changing and giant cataclysmic things like comets or asteroids impacting Earth and causing essentially nuclear fallout for many, decades at a time? And why not have all that, completely just decimate any evidence we would have had of that civilization?
Right.
I find it all super fascinating, man. I think that's super cool. That's good stuff.
If the past week alone has taught me anything, it's that a cascade of failures like that is entirely possible, even likely.
Exactly.
Exactly.
That's my opinion.
Right. Here in Texas, we had just a symphony of failures happen all at one time that put millions and millions of people at risk, basically. It put them out of power, out of heat, in the middle of the worst cold snap in Texas written history, that as far as we can remember.
Right. Exactly. So that was not caused by humans.
Right.
The catalyst for it was this 50-year or maybe even 100-year cold snap.
Right.
Which we should expect at this point. But at the same time, it's bad business to try to prepare for that for the other 99 years. It's too expensive, and it causes all kinds of things. So now we've got a system that failed because we had something that we sort of expected but didn't know when it was going to happen.
Yeah.
If that makes sense, right? So all these, like you said, all these cascading failures led to, essentially a glimpse of probably what has happened in human history in the past many times.
Right. Exactly.
That's cool, man. Speaking of intelligence, I think you had a feeling I was going to go with this one today, in light of recent conversations. Here's something that is really cool. I think this is one of those things that most people know is real, but maybe haven't really dived into before. One of the things that fascinates me both in real life and certainly in my fiction, I've used this in The Ice Chasm before among some of my sci-fi stuff like Relics, is artificial intelligence. And when I say it, I specifically mean the intelligence that humans create in a computer system. We essentially teach something to learn, or at least to teach something to follow certain parameters we lay out, and do something that usually resembles human intelligence in some way, some narrow way. And so some of those keywords I'm using, narrow and general and human, all that, that's sort of how, that's one way to define artificial intelligence. And specifically that is 3 different forms or levels, I should say, of artificial intelligence, starting with weak AI, or in other words, artificial narrow intelligence. And this is the one that's like my robot vacuum and robot mop that my wife uses to clean the house. These are examples of an artificial intelligence, but they're very narrow. They only do one thing. When they hit a wall, a literal boundary, they turn and go. They don't actually know where they are. They're just running into stuff all the time, stumbling forward throughout life. Actually, there's probably some ties to actual humanity here. I think maybe most of us are just weak AI stumbling through life. There's our soundbite for the show today, by the way.
There you go.
I should use that one. That's artificial narrow intelligence, and we've certainly accomplished that. Like I gave you an example of, the robot vacuums, but anything from a calculator to the computers that we have to just anything like something like a microphone that I'm talking into right now has a narrow intelligence of what it's supposed to do. And that's just electronics, it's not really thinking or anything, but the next level up is that artificial general intelligence that we all sort of have experienced in different ways. I think cell phones would probably fall into this category, or specifically maybe apps on cell phones, or a chat bot. If anyone's ever had the joy of talking to a computer robot in a messenger chat to try to get some tech support.
Yeah.
That would, I guess, probably still be a narrow AI, don't you think? But coming up on the cusp of being general AI. I guess the definition, Kevin, is general AI is what we consider human capabilities. So on par with human capabilities. And the reason I think these are vague is I've met a lot of humans that I don't think are on par with human capabilities.
Right.
So it's hard to say, if an artificial general intelligence is on par with human capabilities, because we tend to think of humans as pretty smart. And I tend to be a more realist.
Well, you've heard of the Turing test, right?
Yes, I was gonna mention that too. Is out of the original, or at least the most popular test for whether or not a computer is considered intelligent.
Right.
Tell us about it. I mean,
in general terms, I mean, it is basically if in a blind test, if someone can't tell the difference between if they're having a conversation with an entity on the other side of a screen and they can't tell the difference between that entity, an artificial entity, and a human entity, then that would pass the Turing test. So it's basically using actual humans to test artificial intelligence. And I've seen, this has been around for years, by the way. None of this stuff is new at all. Turing himself, that was during World War II was when he created,
that was Alan Turing. He built
Turing,
a computer,
the Enigma machine.
Yep,
or they were trying to crack
Yep.
the Enigma machine.
Great movie about that too, by the way. If anyone hasn't seen it yet, Benjamin Cumberbutton, or whatever his name is. Cumberbun.
Benedict Combiner.
Benadryl Combine. Yeah, that guy.
So
he plays Alan Turing.
Doctor Strange. What's interesting is, you did a little you and I did a little test yesterday of an AI, and it was really fun. It's got my brain buzzing about things I could use it for, but it was very effective, and in a sense, it could pass a Turing test in one aspect, and it's something I hadn't considered before in terms of the Turing test. But so I think there has to be degrees of success on a Turing scale, because if we gave it a prompt, it could write something based on that prompt that was in fact human readable. Like we would read it and interpret meaning. Yeah. Right. But then it would fail the Turing test in other aspects, like you kind of set up a sort of digital help desk scenario, and you were talking to it about its product, the product it represented, and it just kind of floundered and failed. It had a logical thread in the conversation, but it got in kind of a loop and became too literal, and it was easy to tell you were talking to an artificial intelligence.
I think and so just as a little background, yesterday Kevin and I got on a call and we played around with OpenAI's GPT-3 is what they're calling their intelligence, and they're a company that's doing some really cool stuff in the AI community. They also, and I'll kind of get into this a little bit, they're going for artificial intelligence that is also has human standards for morals and ethics, which is definitely a complicated subject. But basically, they want to prevent Skynet while also building Skynet. They want to be able to prevent, the iRobot situation from happening, while still being able to create artificial intelligences. And of course, there's no legislation for or against either of these things. So we're all just sort of looking at this as like, wow, this is really cool. What could be? But essentially, they fed this OpenAI artificial intelligence the internet. They let it read. I think it literally read all of Reddit and Wikipedia And so there's definitely, you can obviously take some conclusions from that, but it's able to string together, like Kevin said, sentences that make sense. And more than that, it can actually pretty well interpret what you're asking it to do. It uses a form of prompts rather than trying to code something or give it parameters like what artificial narrow intelligence like chatbots do.
Right.
You just feed it a prompt, and that could be as simple as a question, or like what we did. You and I were sitting there going, well, how do we get it to write a blog post about a certain subject? Let's give it a couple paragraphs and just see if it continues. And it literally did.
Yeah.
At one time, it even gave us like a list of, here's do this, and then here's how you do it, and then do this, and here's how you do it. It's pretty incredible stuff. I wouldn't say it's ready to be implanted inside of a walking, hominid-shaped robot or anything.
No, but
it's
I think
not far away either.
It's definitely graduated to a level of being good for assistive technology. And like you said, you can essentially program it with prompts rather than having to know code, which is kind of one of those, like all of the technology that we take for granted now started off as a bad user experience in a sense.
Yeah.
And it's all kind of gotten better with time, where just take GPS technology as an example. Like I remember when GPS tech kind of came out in the public sector, it had been around in the military for 20 years, but when it hit retail, first of all, it was super expensive, but it was also completely text-based. Like you didn't have maps, you had coordinates. And but I still wanted one because I could,
because they were cool.
It was awesome, and I could pinpoint myself within. I remember I was working at a Radio Shack, and a guy came in with one, and he was buying batteries for it, and he basically was telling us all about it. He's very proud of it. He's like, yeah, this can pinpoint me within 50 feet. Well, I mean, now you can pinpoint something within like a few inches. I mean, you can get very and better depending on how sophisticated. If it's military grade, they could really find you. But so that technology's evolved, but the user experience of that technology also evolved. So adding maps and then figuring out how to pinpoint you on a map and then updating maps as you go, that's all advances in the way the user interacts with that technology. So the AI experience right now is sort of it started at that sort of text level where in order to use AI you had to be able to code, but has now stepped up in evolution to where normal human beings who don't know anything could start using it for some really helpful things. And one of those for us, I mean, when we were looking at it, I thought, this is, and we were the same way. Like as a research tool, it's incredible. Like we literally said, hey, how would we explain the
Fermi paradox?
The Fermi paradox to a 12-year-old, and it told us in a couple of sentences what that was.
It literally did. I mean, it wasn't even like a plagiar. So, and it's not plagiarizing either.
Right? No,
that's the best part. It's not just grabbing something from
original.
Wikipedia. It's coming up with some original, cobbled together thought that actually is coherent. It makes sense.
What impressed me more though was when we said, "Hey, summarize this article," and you put a link in there. And it came back with a summary of that article that was
literally and I read the abstract for that article that we posted. It was about what was the something molecular sexuality or something like that.
Yeah.
Something weird like I'd never heard of, and I was like, okay, cool. Well, here's an abstract about it, which is already over my head. So I know that it didn't just grab the abstract; it literally summarized the article and gave us a way to understand it, and it was incredible. It knew what we wanted from the prompt. Which is kind of that next step is what you're getting at, is that user interface is far better than what I've seen before. So it still has a ways to go.
It's like an evolutionary jump for Wikipedia is what it is.
Right. Exactly.
We can say, I want to know everything there is to know about, I don't know, Patrick Stewart, and it will go, but I want to know in 100 words or less. And it'll give you a 100-word summary of the life of Patrick Stewart. Now, it remains to be seen how accurate any of that is. We didn't test that.
That definitely really needs some testing, but I think it's incredible. And the thing that I'm ultimately getting at is, the third type of intelligence, which is artificial superintelligence, where an AI is smarter, and I'm putting that in quotes because there's different ways to measure IQ, of course, and intelligence in humans, like the emotional, the EQ tests, which I think is going to take even longer for us to develop as far as code. But a super intelligence will be able to learn on its own. And then we get to something called the singularity, because it's constantly learning. And pretty soon it knows so much, it can probably just defy the laws of physics and float around like a little orb and, zap people with lasers. And that's kind of the fearful part of it. But, this AI that we tested is pretty close. It's probably the closest one I've seen that's consumer facing. But, the thing that I always go back to is, even if we do have an intelligence that's just ready to go and be installed in like the next generation of Teslas or whatever, there's going to be some serious moral and ethical dilemmas that we have to figure out how to cover. The use case that I always think of, that I swear I'm going to use it in a book one day, is this idea that you need to be able to have an AI that can make the decision for you who to kill. And what I mean is, let's say you put it in a car, and this car is an auto self-driving car or whatever. You're just sitting in the back, and all of a sudden there's a person walking across the street, and the car knows that you're going too fast to be able to stop. If it swerves out of the way, it's likely going to kill you, the passenger. If it continues forward, you're going to be perfectly fine, and the car's going to be fine, but the person's likely going to die because it's going to have to run into them.
Right.
So which decision does the car make?
So that's the classic trolley car problem.
What? I thought I came up with that. I thought that was original thought. I take full credit for it.
You don't know this whole thing? If you're a fan of the television show The Good Place, they made an entire episode about this problem.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
This philosophical problem.
So they must have listened to me then.
Yeah.
They must have got it from me.
So I wrote about I write a series that involves an AI, and if you really drill down on how it's being used in that book, it's scary as hell, even though the person using it is a good guy and is sort of virtuous to the point of being uncorruptible in that book. And she'd have to be, because that software represents an absolute power in that universe, and she is able to use it in a very efficient way to just really walk through digital privacy, digital security. I mean, it's a wide open world to her, and it's a quantum-based AI, which sounds like I'm just jamming technical terms together. But in my research into AI and into quantum computing, I'm like, well, they're going to get those two crazy kids together at some point, because they're made for each other.
Exactly.
Quantum computing is, at its heart, if you consider digital machines now, they operate on a principle of ones and zeros. There's an on and off. So it's binary. But in quantum computing, if I remember correctly, there are actually 13 states. So you exponentially increase the processing power with a lot less input. So
it effectively is testing a bunch of solutions and failing each time until it reaches the solution that isn't failing.
But doing it
in some ways,
instantly.
but it's doing it so fast.
Yeah.
Because it's got these different switches, unlike where binary is just ones and zeros.
Yeah. So combine that with AI, and I mean, especially self-teaching AI.
Right.
And we no longer, there's no longer any need for humanity in the universe at that point. So hopefully the singularity includes. So Richard Feynman believed that the singularity would be a sort of coming together of human and artificial intelligence. We would merge into a sort of supermind. And I don't think we're that far off from it. But consider the dilemma of knowing other human beings' thoughts just through things like social media. Like we have discovered thanks to social media, that there is a clear divide in the way at least two different groups of people think. Right. So
that's true. Yeah.
Just imagine when we're all part of one universal mind.
We're all wired into one singularity.
I know we're running low on time, man. So I'll stop.
No, yeah, we're good. That's good stuff. Always more time for fun stuff that's real and also that's cool. Stuff that's real that you didn't know was real, but also is cool. There, nailed it. Dang it. Anyway, that's the show this week. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in once again. We are your hosts, Nick Thacker and Kevin Tumlinson. All the show notes, everything we've talked about today and mentioned is going to be linked in the show notes. Just go check that out. You can click away, and if you do have something you want us to cover, if you think you know something that's cool that we may not know is cool, we want to know about it. We want to hear about it. Just head over to stuffthat'sreal.com. And without further ado, we will talk to you next week.
Stuff That's Real.